If you've been to a wedding recently that is officiated by a pastor or a priest, you may have heard someone speak about love from a very well-known Bible passage. But my guest today says we need to talk about it a lot more often than just at weddings. And today, author Tim Whitehead joins us to dive in. Great to see you again, Tim.
Cheryl, it is great to see you too. It's been 17 years since I left Crossroads.
17 years, that's not possible.
It's great to be back. Well, yeah, it has. You don't see the gray?
Well, we love having you here. And, you know, we're talking about this Bible passage, this famous Bible passage. So if people don't know what I'm talking about, what is it?
Okay, so 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, love doesn't envy, and on and on and on. We only bring that passage out during wedding ceremonies.
Yeah.
But in my own life, in discipleship with Christ, trying to be a good Christian, and serving God vocationally, I mean, it's my job to tell others about Jesus, I realized that I wasn't loving my neighbor, loving God the way I was supposed to. And the Holy Spirit brought me to 1 Corinthians 13 in this list of characteristics of love that have nothing to do with romance, have nothing to do with a wedding, infatuation, or anything like that. It's heavy lifting, difficult choices on how we treat others and how we respond to God. Okay,
so your job, technically, if you had to break it down, is kind of love. Like, as you said, so you are the executive director of Galcom.
Yeah.
How is Galcom loving people around the world?
Okay, so what we do is we go around the world building radio stations, good old-fashioned radio stations in some of the craziest parts of the world you can imagine. Up in Greenland, islands of Indonesia, we just put one in the jungles of South Sudan, and then we manufactured these. It's a little solar-powered, fixed-tuned radio and audio Bible. 70% of the world doesn't read. 60% doesn't have electricity in their homes. There's no infrastructure, and on and on. And so this is a tool so people can hear the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ and his love for them, in their own language. And so we do this all over the world. But in my personal life, I guess the impetus that my study really started, I'm working here at Crossroads, I'm serving God, and then my neighbors put up a for sale sign. And I realized I had never shared the gospel with my neighbor. I never loved them enough to care about their soul. Never really had a conversation. And the Holy Spirit started working with me saying, Tim, sure, you're doing this for a living. And you're doing it, to be paid. But do you love people like I love people?
Wow.
And that's where this started. So sure, I'm the Great Commission I got handled. But it's the Great Commandment that I was having trouble with.
Wow, that's amazing. So you wrote a book that you dived into this very deep, Love Personified, and I love your subtitle, Is Loving Tacos the Same as Loving My Enemies and Loving God? Now, is it?
No. See, and this is, we throw around the word love too easily.
Yeah.
So when people say, I love you to their spouse, it's infatuation, it's attraction. Or, it's with the kids, my kids would say, all right, we're having tacos today. I love tacos. That's definitely not what Jesus is talking about when he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So, but I learn best with stories. And so what I've done is taken those characteristics, love is patient, love is kind, and so on, and found somebody in the Bible that personified it. That's an example for me, for others, on how to respond in certain situations so that it is love.
So it was really good. One of my favorites was love does not parade itself, it says in one translation. And you think about our culture, we're all about self-promotion, social media, YouTube, like, here's what I'm doing. You meet people, what do you do for a living? This is kind of how we are.
Yes.
So who's your example and why should we not do that?
Okay, so for love does not parade itself was Moses, who was, the writer says, the most humble man. And most scholars think that it was Moses that wrote it. So come on, is he really humble? But then when you start to unpack his life, God says of Moses, there's no greater prophet. I speak to Moses face to face, not in dreams like I do with others. The way Moses was used throughout the whole time of bringing the Israelites out of Egypt to the promised land. But over and over again, Moses shines the light on God. The water coming from the rock. God has given you the water. God has done this. When the people start to complain, he says, you're not complaining to me. I'm not in charge here. You're complaining against God. But then you have the one failure where he does hit the rock and say, do God and I have to give you water? And you see the little bit of the humanity, the failing. He's not perfect, right? So that love for God, though, comes through in his life over and over and over again. The Israelite leaders come and complain to him. And it says that he prostrated himself and bowed down in front of them. asking forgiveness, like this continual humility,
Wow.
never taking the power and authority that he could have, and always shining the light back on God.
I love that you chose Moses because it's kind of been a desire of my own heart to be called a friend of God like he was. It's such an amazing honor. Now, one of the things I liked about this is you also gave an example of what not to do. So love keeps no record of wrongs.
Yes.
Instead of showing somebody who was super forgiving, you showed somebody who's actually, like marking off every wrong.
Yeah, Jacob. This is a big issue with us. The world tells us you got to get even, or at least you got to get justice. And Jacob goes through his whole life keeping score. Even as an infant, we have this little thing where, he's grabbing onto Esau's heel. We don't hear a lot about the childhood, but as soon as Esau comes in from the field hungry, it's like Jacob's been waiting for this chance to be the firstborn. I want your birthright. And then he wants the blessing. And then he gets to Laban and he's keeping score with Laban. You changed my wages 10 times, and he's always keeping score. And he gets to the point where he's coming back home, and he's been keeping score, so he thinks everybody else has been. And he's terrified of Esau. So he splits up his family, and he's sending gifts. And his whole life is racked with this fear and guilt because he thinks others are keeping score, because he has, and he's missed out on all sorts of peace and blessing because he's been keeping score.
Imagine what the world would look like if we actually took just 1 Corinthians 13 seriously and did it. I mean, it's a tall order. What do you think would be different about our world?
I think I write in the book, if we could just master 2, maybe 3 of these, we would be radical Christians. Our lives would be marked with such a different behavior that people would see us and go, what is this guy all about? What is she all about? We would be so counterculture. We would be forgiving to a fault. We would be trusting and believing in others and encouraging others. Our behavior towards God, we would be uncompromising in our obedience to God. And back to Moses, in honoring God. It wouldn't be about us. It wouldn't be about our titles and what we do. It would all be about, I'm just a servant of God. Back to our work at Galcom, our founder, Alan McGraw, always had a saying, I'm just a piece of clay. Back to the idea that we're just a jar, a clay pot that God has molded for his use. And if we have this idea of love for God, totally changes our behavior.
I love that biblical picture of a clay pot, because in the cracks is where you see the light. And sometimes in our weaknesses is where we see this incredible gift of God living inside of us. Yeah. I always say, if you see anything good about me, it's God. If you see anything that's not good about me, don't blame him. Please. Yeah. Right? So you wrote this book because you realized that you weren't living up to love. So what has this study done for you as you've dived into all these attributes of love?
Well, talking about light shining through, it shone a light on all sorts of failures. And here's the thing. Most of your guests here on Huntley Street, and I would work here, life-changing television is what we used to say, and wonderful testimonies of people coming out of these real difficult situations and maybe a whole life of crime and these radical testimonies. But for the most of us as Christians, we get a little comfortable, a little self-righteous. We start to look down our nose at others. And so what it's really helped me do is to recognize, anything that you see bad, that's me. And anything good, that's God. It's not me. And so it's really broken down my self-righteousness. It's broken down my pride. And it's made me realize that it's submitting to God, submitting to his Holy Spirit in my life, that then allows me to love. It's not something I conjure up in myself. It's not something that I practice at and get good at. It's submitting to the Holy Spirit. So it's really changed my behavior and my treatment of others.
That's so inspiring. I think we're all on that journey, but it's a really good thing to dive in and kind of look at that and say, okay, here's the areas that we can improve. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming to share this today. This went by way too fast.
We're already done. Wow, okay.
I know, right? Exactly. And hey, if you're watching this and you're kind of like, yeah, I could use a lot of work on loving, prayer does actually make a difference. And we invite God into, as Tim so wisely said, our situation and ask for his help. He will give it. And if you want someone to pray with you, that's why our prayer lines are there. Why not give that a shot? And let's see what happens if we all start pursuing this example of what the Bible talks about love. That number is 1-866-273-4444, or you can email us at prayer@crossroads.ca.